Okay, welcome back everyone. Good morning, and again, welcome to our webinar, How to Maximize Your U.S. Export Strategy. My name is Natalie McGlynn, and I will be your host for the next hour. I'm a marketing consultant here on the Purolator team, and we're happy to bring you today's content. Today, we're going to be talking all about exporting to the U.S. and how to strengthen your U.S. exporting strategy. Joining us for the conversation will be Jeff Colley from Purolator's product development team, and we've also got here Phil Turi from Export Development Canada. So before I give the mic over to the team, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. So today the content will run for about 45 minutes. And we've left a good chunk of time, about 15 minutes at the end, to run through question and answers. So with respect to the questions, as I'm sure you'll all have several, if you can kindly use the questions chat box on your GoToWebinar panel, type in your question and we will be funneling them and saving them all for the end. So we won't be answering them during the webinar. We'll be compiling them and tackling them at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff and we're going to get going. Enjoy.
Terrific. Thank you, Natalie, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on how to maximize your U.S. export strategy, and we're glad you've been able to join us this morning. My name is Jeff Colley. I'm Senior Manager of Product and Technology Marketing at Purolator, and I'm joined by Philip Turi, Director of Strategy and Innovation at Export Development Canada. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks, Jeff.
And for today's webinar, we've put together what we hope will be a valuable session full of tactics and best practices that can help you strengthen your export strategy and provide you with a starting point to better understand some of the key trends that make the U.S. market a good growth opportunity. We'll also touch on ways to go about building or enhancing your export strategy, including reasons for market entry or investment, understanding some of the associated challenges and risks, and approaches to developing your export plan. Then we'll wrap up by digging into specific U.S. markets where you can look for opportunities specific to your industry and ways that you can extend your business's reach into new markets. I'm now going to hand things over to Philip Turi from EDC, who will introduce himself fully to get us started.
Great, thanks a lot, Jeff, and thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the team at Purolator for the invitation to come out and speak to all of you today. Also, a big thank you to everyone who's on the line and who's attending. I hope that in the short amount of time that we have today, I can add some value to your U.S. export plan and your U.S. export strategy. So before I get into the sort of formal presentation and some of the content that we've prepared for you today, I just want to mention a few words about Export Development Canada. So we're a Canadian Crown Corporation founded in 1944, fully financially self-sustaining. We're also Canada's export credit agency, which means we're mandated to support and develop Canada's export trade through the provision of primarily products. So on the one hand, we provide financial products such as working capital financing, guarantees, overseas expansion financing, project financing, and underwriting. We also run a large insurance business, and for us, insurance is critical to helping Canadian exporters manage their risk. So some of the products you'll hear about when you speak to EDC are things like accounts receivable insurance, single buyer insurance, and political risk insurance. We also offer other products such as bonding, which are particularly helpful for clients in the services space and the space that I operate in, small business services. So there's two services that we run, matchmaking services as well as advisory services. And I'm the fortunate one to be able to run EDC's advisory business. So in that capacity, I do oversee a team of export advisors who help clients and prospects navigate through the complexity of international business by responding to trade-related questions our customers and prospects have on a daily basis so that they can move forward in their export journey more confidently. So our team is well equipped to answer questions related to readiness and whether or not you're ready to export, market intelligence, not just in the US, but markets all over the world, market entry and understanding all of the details that you have to be aware of with respect to market entry. That covers things like regulation, taxes, customs, and investing abroad, as well as risk mitigation. So EDC's current state view of the U.S. market is quite optimistic. I should mention before talking about why we're optimistic, the fact that 85% of our current customers are small and medium-sized businesses, and 100% of them start by exporting to the U.S. market. And there are a variety of reasons for that. The biggest one is simply just closeness and distance to the U.S. market. And we can spend a little bit of time later on talking more about that. But the big takeaway here from this slide is that we are quite actually optimistic about the U.S. market over the next year. So from the highest possible level, Canada, the U.S. GDP is expected to outpace Canadian GDP growth next year at 3% versus Canada's 2.2%. We're optimistic largely because of a number of leading indicators that indicate pent-up demand supportive of growth in the U.S. market. So some of the leading indicators that we draw upon when we look at the U.S. market are things like labor force participation rates. These have been on a steady rise since 2015. Private sector wages and salaries have also been on the rise since 2016. And this suggests to us a continued tightening in the U.S. labor market. This is a good leading indicator of growth, investment, and consumption, and this has implications across many Canadian export industries, and so is something that you should be looking at positively if you're looking at the U.S. market. It also suggests that labor market slack has been higher than initially thought of. This is how companies in the United States are hiring 200,000 new workers per month, despite an aging population. The economy's ability to expand the labor force reduces the risk of a sudden spike in inflationary pressures and allows the Fed to hike interest rates gradually and over a longer period of time. The other leading indicator that we look at is purchase orders. So we actually have looked at these and we feel that these are up across the board, across all industries. And again, this is indicative of increasing demand and consumption in the U.S. market. So big takeaway in the U.S. market is we're optimistic because we feel it's going to continue to grow, and that will present opportunities for Canadian exporters.
Those are some terrific insights, Phil. Thanks for sharing those with us. And what we found also is when you dig into some of the segment-specific numbers, whether we're talking about B2B or B2C, it really calls out that there's a great opportunity for exporters. As an example, looking at the fact that roughly 20% of Canadian small businesses are selling online and even fewer are engaging in cross-border commerce. In 2016, 22 million Americans shopped online from Canadian businesses, spending almost $9 billion. So with room for small business to continue to ramp up in this space, along with those favorable economic indicators that you pointed out, like U.S. buyers that are empowered with a favorable exchange rate, creating strength in their purchasing power, it represents a fantastic opportunity for growth by Canadian small businesses.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So at this point in the presentation, I think it's important to get into some of the meat. But before we get into the meat around building out your U.S. export strategy, I wanted to say a few things about why, because I think this is important. In Canada, relative to other OECD economies, we actually don't have as many small businesses that are exporting as other OECD economies, and there's a whole variety of reasons for that, which I won't go into today. But the why comes down to a couple of things. One, the U.S. market is simply 10 times the size of Canada's. The market is close enough and large enough that is enough of an imperative to look at when deciding on why export and why export to the U.S. Our research and also broader Government of Canada research indicates that businesses that export tend to be more productive. They also tend to be more responsive to customer preferences. They draw upon larger data points, which is helpful to inform new product development, new services that are launched, and all of these things help to create a more competitive business. And this is right across the board when we've looked at thousands of Canadian export businesses and compared them to those that are not exporting. So the benefits are quite substantial and do indicate that companies that are looking at exporting simply would just be more competitive overall than those that aren't. The next critical thing is understanding whether or not you're ready. Yeah, that's good. So understanding whether or not you're ready. I mean, several organizations offer export readiness assessments, and feel free to take any of those assessments and apply it to your business. I mean, the common element to all of these export readiness assessments is understanding whether or not there's sufficient interest at the corporate level inside your company, and also a commitment to sustainable growth. The Canadian market is simply too small for companies to find sustainable growth over the long term. So understanding whether or not you're ready really comes down to understanding that there are going to be costs. The most common ones are related to developing your strategy, which we're talking about today. Talent acquisition, and that includes the people that will help you get into those markets, such as business development folks or export managers with the right credentials to do so. But it also means having the necessary team domestically, so that, let's say, if you're in manufacturing, the factory has enough skilled workers to be able to meet orders as they come in. You may have had experience in the past with exporting that might have been passive, but if you're going to be taking a deliberate step forward and developing a strategy, that obviously implies that you are thinking through the capacity you have at home here to actually deliver on some of the orders that are coming in. And of course, in the absence of these resources, the best strategy is really going to not do you anything if you don't have the ability to actually deliver on it. So it's really important to think about the resources that you're assembling as you start to step forward and put together that exporting strategy. The other element that companies need to be aware of is there are more risks. That should never be a deterrent, because there's actually lots of help here in Canada, in the exporting community in particular. But it is important to know that getting paid may be more difficult. You're going to have to figure out how your team will manage a customer that's asking you for terms, and understanding what those terms are and how to manage those operationally. Arranging for shipping and other transportation costs requires an understanding of duties and taxes, and working with intermediaries. That is not necessarily a risk. It can be managed for, but it's something that needs to be addressed. It's obviously going to be more expensive to acquire, serve, and retain customers, whether that's spending online to attract customers to your product or to your brand, or it's actually doing it through soft resources such as people pounding the pavement and meeting with potential intermediaries and potential customers. It's simply going to be more expensive. The other mistake that I think companies fail to address or think through is the fact that the bigger sometimes seems better, and bigger isn't always better. A very common mistake that we see at EDC for companies starting out is they tend to overestimate market attractiveness and they underestimate costs. So that's a really big thing, and I'll talk a little bit about some strategies to manage for that later on in this presentation. The other element that it's important to understand is just the risk of theft. And by that, I mean IP, and how you manage your IP portfolio and how you protect critical IP as you now operate in a new market. Perhaps less so in the US, but especially with other markets, corporate social responsibility is critical to any Canadian export business. And so running diligence, I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation, is critical. Just understanding suppliers in a foreign market, understanding buyers in a foreign market, making sure that you're tight from a corporate social responsibility perspective is also really key. So now let's get into the basics. I've talked a little bit about why we're optimistic about the US market. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we think the US market will continue to grow. We mentioned things like the labor market as well as purchase orders. So growth is a great way to sort of level set building out your strategy. At the end of the day, though, you still have to pick a market. And by picking a market, I'm not just saying the US market versus China or the US market versus the EU. Within the US market, there are multiple markets, and we'll talk about that later. There's regional markets, there's industrial markets, and I think most of you on the call today are well aware of that. But sometimes companies fail to appreciate the fact that there are so many different markets, and so picking the right one is actually really key. and you need to try and answer the question about sort of what market within the US do we want to enter. The two elements of assessing or picking your market are the attractiveness test and your competitive analysis. With your attractiveness test, what you want to be asking is this a market that we want to be in? Is this a market that we have to be in? And in answering those questions, I encourage companies to look for compound annual growth rates. You can find compound annual growth rates on consumption, on procurement spend. You could even look at things like GDP, purchasing power parity. All of these things within specific sectors are helpful in understanding, is this a market that is growing? Is this a market that we want to be in? But it's more detailed than that. So companies also that do this well look for underserved market segments, underserved customer segments. Underserved customer segments create opportunities to innovate and do things differently than the competition. So this requires a much more in-depth analysis of markets and submarkets, but is a critical thing to be looking for. As well as markets within markets. I think sometimes Canadian companies may look at even a regional market within the US or an industrial market, let's say, the aerospace supply chain and where they fit in, and the size of the market may seem so daunting that companies don't know where to start. Oftentimes companies that do it well think about small market proliferation. So finding a very niche market, a very small market within that broader market, and establish a presence within it. So that's something to think through as well. And then doing your sector analysis. So like understanding the value chain, understanding the supply chain within that market, all factors into the market research that you have to be doing. So that takes us through the attractiveness test. The next element would be your competitive analysis. And here you're trying to answer, can we compete in this market? What I find helpful here is companies that understand their product market fit do well in actually executing a competitive analysis. So this is looking at indicators like the number or size or even quality of firms that are operating within a particular supply chain and who are servicing a target market. You're also looking here at market share and what the current market share is and whether or not there's room for growth or even opportunities to disrupt market share. This also means that you're looking at what the incumbents are doing. Those incumbents can be big firms, they can be small firms. Are you operating in a red ocean or a blue ocean? A red ocean obviously is red because there's tons of competition. If the key in operating in a red ocean is to find areas where you can incrementally create value to create a blue ocean for yourself. And so those are, this is sort of strategy 101 stuff that you can apply, frankly, in a domestic market, but it is highly relevant when you're looking at an international market. Answering whether or not you compete also is something that requires a bit of a VRIO analysis. Again, this is a simple strategy tool, but companies can use this in international markets. So in the US market, this means sitting down and looking at your firm's core competencies and understanding what makes the business valuable, or what makes these resources valuable, what makes them rare, what makes them difficult to imitate, and also what makes the collection of these things together organizationally savvy such that they're valuable domestically and then can be even more valuable in that market. There's also a cage analysis that you can do, which I won't speak to today. Cage analysis refers to the cultural, administrative, geographic and economic elements that create distance between markets and the market that you're looking to penetrate. There I would say take note of the USMCA, for example. Take note of regulation. Take note of how you can leverage even things like product labeling and complying with, let's say, regulatory standards as a competitive advantage. These are things that position Canadian companies differently than your European competitors or competitors from other markets. So think through that. And I guess the big takeaway here is, research and data points means that you'll have a better strategy and be able to make better decisions than operating without research and without data. So if this means conducting your own research, there's a variety of tools you can use that are free online. There's the Google Market Finder, which I think is a great tool to understand what individuals and companies are searching online. So that tool allows you to enter in what you sell and gives you some great statistics in terms of who's searching for that item. There's also tools like Statista and a variety of other market research tools that you can use. But I should also mention that BDC offers their advisory business. They offer a program called their International Market Selection Program, and I think would be something that you might benefit if conducting your own market research is going to be too timely or costly for you. So let's move on. Great, so we've worked through the attractiveness test. We've worked through the competitive analysis. Now let's talk about bringing your strategy to life. So here, I mean, there's a whole bunch of points that I can make, but I've tried to summarize them in sort of 4 key bullets. The first one is once you've selected your market, once you've sort of thought through that this is an attractive market that we have to be in, once you've thought through that the fact that there's competitors and that you have a competitive edge, it's important to think through starting local but thinking global. So by this, I mean that after selecting the market you want to enter, start to mobilize your domestic network. And by that, I mean the domestic network of advisors, customers, suppliers, trade associations, and government partners that you have around you here in Canada that have international linkages. This is actually the most cost-effective way to bring your U.S. market entry strategy to life. The truth is, your customers are probably, some of them, especially if you're in a B2B type business, are probably have relationships in the U.S., as do your suppliers. Organizations like the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service have offices across the United States at Canada's consulates and at our embassy in Washington, D.C. It's their job to build networks internationally and in the U.S. market for your benefit. So I would highly encourage you to think through connecting with the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service here in Canada, explaining to them that you're looking to expand to the U.S., and also seeing if they've got networks that are of value. These organizations can help you understand where your network is strong in the U.S. market, and they can also help you understand where your network is patchy or spotty, and where you perhaps need to bolster building out a network, let's say with a shipping partner, for example, or carrier.
Yeah, those are all great points, Phil. And I think that to your point about leveraging your domestic partners and that you're already doing business with, and if you are doing business with Purolator domestically, this is the right time to engage them in terms of your export strategy. We often encourage our customers to engage upfront and early in their exporting journey, so that they can work with one of our team members in a consultative role to support their business in creating access to the new markets. They can work on a number of different facets to help get you ready, such as consulting around packaging requirements for your products, evaluating your technology needs and putting a solution in place, and even developing an operations plan that's specific to a customer's business, really taking into account product availability, a business's operating hours, the key shipping lanes that a business wants to focus on from a target perspective. Really understanding what those target markets are, because there are different transit times to take into account, and making sure that we're talking about readiness to meet those demands of receivers. Another component we can also start to work on with our customers is to evaluate the returns management requirements, so that they can plan for non-deliverables or returns that actually need to be brought back into the Canadian market. And then obviously, ensuring that our customers are ready to navigate the border from a clearance perspective as well.
Great, Jeff. No, you're absolutely right. Especially if you're in the retail sector, thinking through returns, because they're going to happen, is critical. So really, really good point. The second element here is aligning aligning clear outcomes to your market entry strategy. So one of the easiest ways to dip your toes into a foreign market for the first time is to start attending conferences. You could literally attend conferences probably every day of the year next year in the United States if you want to, and you may or may not actually start to produce the type of sales results that you want. So actually selecting the right conferences where your target market is gathering is critical. So this means actually asking questions like whether or not there will be agents and distributors at that conference that you could partner up with, because you may not find end customers. It means thinking about if you sell mobile medical clinics, going to a conference where there's competitors may not be necessarily the right conference for you. It's perhaps going to a conference where folks in the healthcare community are gathering. Sounds obvious and sometimes difficult to determine whether or not you're going to be able to get that kind of value out of a trade show. But trade shows are very expensive. If you're actually going to be setting up booths and presenting your technology, your products, or your innovation, you really need to ask those questions. Take a look at who else is exhibiting at those conferences. Take a look at the types of partners that are going to be attending, and ask for lists, especially if you're going to be spending money as an exhibitor. The other critical thing is understanding the difference between an agent and a distributor. And I'll talk about this more later on in the presentation, but there is a difference. An agent can be leveraged to sell your product in a market, but you're ultimately responsible for that sale and everything that goes into a sale, whether it's warranties, managing returns, all of that great stuff. Now, a distributor can be leveraged if, let's say, you don't have a brand in a local market and a distributor has a brand and has some established networks, distribution networks to tap into. Partnering up with the distributor is critical. They typically buy product from you as opposed to an agent who facilitates a sale, but it's typically it's a customer that's actually buying directly from you. So those are important differences, and I think we tend to just group agents and distributors together. They're very different legally, and they're also very different operationally. So it's important to understand that. The other critical piece to working with intermediaries is running diligence. There's lots of organizations that you can refer to run diligence. But you can also run some of your own diligence, and like the basic best practices is asking for customer testimonials, especially if you're a B2B type business where it's not as easy to just look at what customers are saying online about a product or a business. So asking for customer testimonials is really key. Here, organizations like the Canadian Trade Commissioner Service can help you with this. There's also helpful tools such as Factiva, or even Dun & Bradstreet. Doing a credit check or a credit lookup on a buyer is something that you can do through a DMV search. So something to keep in mind there. If you're looking for manufacturers representatives, a good place to begin is with the Directory of Manufacturers Sales Agents at manaonline.org. It's a subscription-based service, but it does allow you to search listings by state, territory, and sector. And is another convenient way to run some of your own diligence. And then the last piece, which is so critical but often forgot about, is setting your partners up for success. So once you've actually successfully found someone that you want to partner with in a foreign market, the relationship just can't end there. And it can't be as simple as what does your sales order book look like on a monthly or quarterly basis. It requires active training, providing these intermediaries with as much product knowledge as possible, using like cost-effective tools online to turn your training about your product into a video and making sure that's shared with and kept up to date for your partner. Having clear sales metrics, having weekly calls. These are all critical things to make sure you operationalize and think through actually before you establish a partnership. with an organization, that you're going to have to put time and energy into doing this up front. So this should all be part of frankly, your broader export strategy, but it's so key to managing for success. Okay, so earlier in the presentation, I talked a little bit about the U.S. market. I should say that EDC does have a chief representative in the U.S. market. His name is Rob Peltier, and for specific questions about the U.S. market and doing business there, Rob is a tremendous resource, and I'm happy to make any referrals or introductions to Rob, as well as the broader EDC U.S. team, especially as it relates to financing or ensuring your export sales in that market. But earlier in the call, given that this is a call about your strategy, your export strategy, I talked a little bit about the fact that the U.S. market is really just a grouping together of 5 regional markets. And then within those regional markets, there are literally hundreds of markets for you to operate in. And so selecting the right market is obviously critical. But it's important to note that each region in the U.S. Presents different clusters of firms and economic activity, and these should be kept in mind, and because they can be used to inform your U.S. export strategy. We have actually a helpful breakdown online on our edc.trade website, which I could provide to Natalie afterwards to share with you. It sort of summarizes some of what I'm going to be telling you now, but let's look a little bit at the different markets. I'm going to start in the Northeast. So there's a huge manufacturing base in the Northeast. About half of U.S. manufacturers actually reside here, which means that this is a tremendous market for commodity sales, but also supply chain development, which is going to be critical when you're thinking about servicing the broader U.S. market. You may need to make tweaks to your supply chain, and so understanding that there's a solid manufacturing base there is really critical. If you're a services-based business, well, tons of opportunity there in terms of selling directly to businesses in that region. Currently, Canada sells plastics, equipment, pharmaceuticals, aerospace components, and medical devices to this region. So that should give you a sense of what Canadian companies are currently doing from an economic activity perspective in that market, and should give you a sense of where partnerships may lie. In the Great Lakes and Midwest region, there's obviously, I mean, might sound obvious to me, but maybe not so to you, but there still is a large concentration of automotive firms and related supply chain businesses. So these are firms in the parts sector, but also increasingly technology firms that are supplying critical technologies to automotive firms in that region. There's also rubber and plastics firms, as well as electronics firms in those regions. Canadian exports to this region have traditionally been energy, machinery, auto parts, wood and paper products, as well as manufactured goods. But increasingly, we're selling agri-food, biotech, and life sciences products to this region. And so that's important, I think, to keep in mind in terms of understanding perhaps where your competitors are playing. In the Southeast, there's a wide range of Canadian products that are being sold into this region. Includes medical equipment and supplies, forestry and wood products, aerospace components, machinery, rubber and plastics. Canadian businesses will find export opportunities, in financial services, insurance, wood products, automotive, and information tech in this region. In the Southeast region of the U.S., there are export opportunities for Canadian companies in forestry and wood products. Sorry, I'm on the Southwest right now. In the Southwest region of the U.S., most of the current opportunities in this region are in energy and the oil and gas sectors. Canada has quite a strong presence in this region and has had for quite some time, given our oil and gas sector. The partnerships here and opportunities for Canadian firms are not just in drilling, but it's also in related supply chains. It's also in the technology and services sectors that support these to support this economic activity, where Canada has quite a bit of potential. So that implies ICT, heavy-duty machinery, all of those types of firms will find opportunities in this region. And then finally, the fifth critical market or large market is the Pacific West. So Canadian technology-based businesses and clean tech businesses are currently successfully penetrating this market. There's growing markets of opportunity in this region in water, wastewater management, as well as water systems infrastructure. Canada has quite the core competency in this subsector, and so if you're operating within this sector, there are opportunities. And that also extends to things like hazardous waste management and recycling, as well as alternative energy solutions, food processing, and then any related firm in the services sector that supports these types of technologies. So we do see opportunities in the Pacific West in these areas.
Thank you, Phil. That was a really comprehensive snapshot of all the sectors across the 5 different regions in the U.S. And when it does come time for you to engage in terms of developing your export strategy, from a Purolator perspective, we do have a terrific national sales team with very deep sector-specific experience across industrials, obviously from machinery and equipment through mining or energy, oil and gas, to speak to some of the sectors that you highlighted, Phil, as well as healthcare from a medical device and equipment standpoint, into consumables and pharmaceuticals. And we want to be able to put those professionals and resources out to our customers so that you guys can leverage them and the collective expertise that they have in those markets, and really making sure that they're able to support your business's export strategy.
Great, thanks, Jeff. The next slide is going a bit more detailed, but here what I wanted to talk about is the mechanics of reaching your new market. So there's a variety of different arrangements that you can enter into and set your business up with to sell into the U.S. market. I think it's critical to understand that the different options that are available to you depend on a couple of things. Number one, your level of interest and engagement in the market, and the best way to indicate whether or not you're serious is obviously hiring and hiring the right people, and allocating funds towards penetrating the market, whatever market is that you've selected, and then also your willingness to collaborate with partners. So, starting at the most basic level of selling directly, or let's say even passively to the U.S., the range of partners you'll have to work with partners, but they're far less than if you were to, for example, set up a foreign subsidiary to sort of push more sustainable sales in a market. So that's important. Level of commitment, engagement, as well as willingness to work with partners those are two sort of, I would say, anchors that should help to flank your export strategy and the actual arrangement that you come up with to sell into that market. Setting these things up obviously requires working with tax advisors, accounting advisors, legal advisors, but thankfully we've got lots of those in Canada, and so I'm sure you'll be able to find the right one. But starting at the highest level, so just sort of starting out in the U.S. market, I think probably many of you on this call are probably already selling into the U.S. market directly. This may require working with an agent, an importing agent, for example, or it may be selling directly to a customer in a market. If, let's say, you're a B2C type business, in which case the range of partners you're working with are far fewer, but I do think it makes sense at that level to be working with a customs broker, a good customs broker, as well as a good carrier to get your product to market, and think through elements like after sales servicing of customers, think through returns, warehousing. All of these things are important. Now, as you move up or sort of move further down the, I would say the continuum, you could obviously set up a permanent type of arrangement and contract with an agent or a distributor. I mentioned the difference between an agent or a distributor earlier in the call, but that's something that should be done with care in your contract if you're going to be setting something up on a more permanent basis. You could also set up a foreign subsidiary. A lot of companies that do this are doing this primarily for tax reasons, but also it's helpful to be closer to a customer. So as you start to sort of drum up more and more sales in the U.S. market, having a sub that, let's say, imports from you and then distributes to customers may actually help you, especially if you're operating within a supply chain. Further down the continuum, there's also licensing production to a foreign manufacturer in the U.S. So the critical thing here is just thinking through your IP protection strategy, IP management, and also royalties and how you'll get paid those royalties. This actually can be, although maybe a more cost-effective way of entering the U.S. market, and maybe cleaner in some respects, it's slightly more complex to set up. So spending a bit more time with your advisors here domestically is important in doing this. There's also strategic alliances and joint ventures. So I think it's funny that oftentimes people assume that a strategic alliance and joint venture are the same thing. Very different things. Joint ventures are their own separate legal entity. They can be very useful when you're thinking type partnerships or a company you're entering into a partnership with does Y. Collectively, you package those things together and you sell those things to a customer. Sequentially meaning that you're sort of responsible for part A of a product. Your partner is responsible for part B. The difference between a strategic and alliance and a joint venture, just critical to understand the difference, but is a permanent, sustainable operation in the U.S. market. And then finally, at the extreme end, an actual foreign firm, either through acquisition or greenfield investment, that manufactures and distributes your products in the U.S. market is something that usually comes much further on down the road after several years of experience, but is something to be kept in mind as well. So, that's the spectrum of arrangements that you should be thinking about entering into, and those things are obviously going to have to be worked through with advisors here domestically to actually affect in the U.S. market to drum up sales.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Phil. I think we've covered a lot of great content here today. So I wanted to say thank you for coming in and partnering with Purolator on this. We hope that we've given you guys some great tactics and thought starters as you begin to develop your strategy or as you flesh it out and continue to improve it. What we're going to do is we're going to jump into, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. We'd like to jump into a few of the questions that we received. We'll do our best to get to them all. The first one here would be for Jeff. So from a Purolator perspective, so the question is, what should I be doing proactively with my shipping partners in order to ready myself as I develop my strategy?
Great, I'll go ahead and give that a shot. Thank you for the time today, everyone, and thanks for your insights as well, Phil. That is a great question. And one of the most foundational things you can do to get ready for exporting in partnership with your provider is obviously to perform a review of your products and packaging. That's going to help optimize your products while they are in transit in our network. This will obviously help reduce any likelihood of damages that might occur. And it'll also improve the dimensional characteristics of your shipments to help lower costs. During our review, our team will obviously look at your needs in terms of servicing your recipients and customers in the US, for example, to help determine the modes of transport that would be best suited to your shipment's needs. We also talked a little bit earlier on in the presentation about developing a specific operating plan for your new export business. And obviously this will take into account the expected order volumes across the markets that you're serving. We talked a lot about the different regional markets in the US today. And that way you can plan your local staff accordingly based on your expected shipping patterns and the development of your return strategy as well.
Perfect. So on to a question, I think, this one would be for Phil. So how should, when looking at a US strategy, how should we be pricing products and services?
Yeah, so this is a good one, and this is a tough one, and I hate to be the guy to say this, but it really does depend on your business. It depends on your product, depends on your service. It also depends on your competitive analysis. So, you know, the critical thing in pricing is you can start by really clearly understanding what your cost will be. And oftentimes customers or companies within the B2B space, you know, there's cost plus, which is something to keep in mind. But understanding that your costs are may be higher when selling into the U.S. market. It really depends on your supplier arrangements. It depends on the supply chain that currently exists or the supply chain you may acquire, factoring in the costs associated with paying duties if you have to. Notwithstanding NAFTA 2.0, there may be duties. There's tax implications as well that you have to think through, that are on top of costs that customers see and see as costs. But once you have a good handle on what your cost is, then I think it's helpful to think about a margin that is reflective of the value you can create in front of a customer that you're selling to. So think through the value to customer when you're thinking through your margin, and it shouldn't be as simple as, well, what is sort of the industry standard in terms of margins. It should be thinking through how you're differentiating such that you can command a higher margin. And so some of the stuff I talked about earlier with regards to, you know, setting out a blue ocean in your strategy and finding ways to differentiate your product in a new market is a critical way to actually beef up your margin, but always start with your cost. I mean, that goes without saying, and work up from there.
Okay. And I guess that goes hand in hand with protecting. Another question we've received is kind of, you know, currency fluctuations and you know, the dollar's changing. So I guess that goes hand in hand with setting yourself up to kind of deal with the ebbs and flows of the currency exchange. Right?
You should be hedging, and there's a variety of about making currency exposure. Sure. And
so I think our next question here, we'll direct it to Jeff. So we've got a couple questions that will kind of combine. So perishables and gate shipping and exporting some of those products.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll provide some high-level commentary as it relates to shipping perishables. There's a few different strategies you can take in terms of protecting your product from a time in transit standpoint as it relates to their lifespan. You know, the obvious one is using products like dry ice in your packaging, gel packs, things that help to manage and regulate the temperature of your product, assuming that will improve the longevity, you know, in terms of the perishable nature of your shipping. So there are a few different options. Some are, really one-time use offerings like your dry ices, like your gel packs, and there are some more substantial refurbishable and returnable products that you can use, that you can integrate into your supply chain for recurring use, should you expect that to be required. So we have a few different solutions that we can bring to you from a Purolator perspective, and we'll be happy to consult with you and see if they can meet your needs.
Some great suggestions. Thank you, Jeff. I hope we've answered that question. I think we've got one more here that we'll flip over to Phil. So in terms of permits and licenses, so what's required of a business before they begin shipping to the U.S.?
Yeah, so from a permitting and licensing perspective, so there's probably quite a few. Again, I hate to be the one to say that it depends on your business. I think across the board, you need to be a registered business. A BN number, for example, allows you to file an export declaration if you're selling into the U.S. market. There's a whole host of forms that you need to fill out at the border. There again, I would actually say the best thing is to work with a customs broker to make sure that from a documentary perspective, you're signed up and you have everything in order. In terms of permits, like operating within local markets, there may be permits that you'd have to let's say, service a customer after sale. But there's a whole host of things that you probably need to think through, such as product labeling. You may need to comply with safety standards. Again, this is so highly company specific, but the other aspect of having a business registration number is also just so that you can make sure that you're paying the right tax. And there's state and local taxes in the United States, and our group at EDC gets a ton of questions about this. Making sure you're having these discussions with your tax advisors here locally, I think is helpful. But you do need registration numbers as well for that, to manage the payments and remittances of taxes.
Okay, we're getting quite a few questions here relating specifically to the costs of shipping. And I'll just point out that what we can do is we'll reach out and address some of these individually later on. Don't want to get too much into it. It all depends on several factors, and it's very individual to the customer and the business that we're speaking to. So we can address any of those specific costs of shipping questions after the webinar. We'll definitely be in touch. There's also a question on, I know Phil provided a number of resources and tools during the presentation. And what we will be doing is putting together a document post-webinar where we can highlight and access and share access for all of the great tools and links that Phil mentioned during the presentation. So I guess just looking here, Jeff and Phil, any other typical questions you get that maybe we can, one more question to wrap up, what do you typically hear?
Yeah, so I will say on the point about accessing resources, so the team that I'm fortunate enough to lead at EDC, we actually call it Export Help. And so if you have really any of the topics we've covered today, if you have questions, including what permit applies to me, what license do I need, where can I find market intelligence, big question that comes up quite a bit is to do with government grants. So this is not like financing for your export business, but access trade shows. I would companies called Can Export, and that's run by Global Affairs Canada. It's something that you can apply to and receive funds to help defray the costs associated with exporting. If you're in, well, depending on the province you're in, there's a whole host of other programs as well that you can tap into. Reach out to my team to those different programs.
Okay, that's great, everyone. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Thank you for taking the time to log in, and we hope that we've created tactical walkaways that will help you strengthen and build your export strategy. Again, if there's any able to address speech to once again, thank you in the area. And with that, have a wonderful, and our next webinar will be taking place in February, and we will coming at you with some great highlights from the peak season. So look out for that in the new year. And once again, thank you. Have a good day, everyone.